All right, the scripture passage we're going to look at today is the first and second chapter of the book of Nehemiah. Now, as we go through life, we can face challenges almost every day. They come in many different forms. We meet them early in our public school years, and then they carry over into college. Then we meet them again on our job. And finally, we meet them in our families and in our churches. As we get older, it seems that as though that it's a lot easier for us to accept hard challenges when we were younger. But the truth is, we're never too old to take on hard tasks. For example, a Navy chaplain retired from the military after many years of hard work, and that took him all over the world. But instead of parking his butt in an easy chair with a TV remote in his hand, he took on the job of pastoring a rundown urban church that was located in a crime-ridden area of the city. And whenever somebody asked him why he did this, he would always tell them it was the toughest job I could find to do. That's the sort of attitude that we need to have if we ever hope to be open to God's leading. Not only do we need the Holy Spirit to guide us, we also need to have enough courage and faith to follow the Lord no matter what our age or our circumstances may be. Whenever we freely offer ourselves to Him for service, the thrill of living for God is always there. But things usually don't happen that way. If you've ever served on the session of a church, I'm sure that you've been at meetings where everyone has agreed that certain things had to be done. But as soon as the moderator would ask for a volunteer to oversee the program, all you can hear is crickets chirping. Then you'd hear enough excuses to fill a book. Everybody was willing to say that it needed to be done, but no one was willing to take on the job. Well, can you really blame them? I mean, after all, most of the projects involve long hours of behind-the-scene work. There are usually not much money to work with. And the people who agreed that the job needed to be done usually aren't anywhere to be found when it comes time to volunteer to actually do the work. And even the ones who do volunteer don't always show up. The leader is the one who has all of the headaches. Then when the project is finally completed, the people in the congregation seldom take the time to thank the leader for all the time and effort they put in on their behalf. But they never seem to have any trouble at all finding time to criticize the way the job was done. And they offer tons of advice on how they would have done it better. Well, if they wanted the job to be done their way, then they should have volunteered to do the job themselves in the first place. And given those circumstances, I can sure understand why people are reluctant to accept a position of leadership in any church. Well, I can't speak for anyone else, but whenever I have agreed to accept a leadership position, it always has been because I felt that God wanted me to do it. And the project usually got done in spite of the people who failed to keep the promise to help. That scenario is why I resigned from the session 2 days after I was elected to another term. You see, I was on the session in 1995 as the worship committee chairman, and when suddenly I ended up in the hospital for 4 months trying to get my life back. When I finally were released from the hospital in 1996, as you can see, I was left with what is known as hemiparesis. For your non-medical types, that means an extreme weakness on one side of my body. In my case, it's the right side. Or I should say, I was right-handed. Well, by the time I was out of the hospital, my term on the session was over, and Steve Graves asked me if I would be willing to serve another term. I told him that I would be willing to do that, but only if certain conditions were met. I remembered how many times people who volunteered to do something didn't show up at the last minute. Well, since I was no longer physically able to pick up the slack, I told Steve that I could serve, but I couldn't be a committee chairman. Now, at the time, there were 2 elders on every committee. And I told Steve that the best I could probably offer would be to help the planning events and to offer advice to the chairman. But after being installed, I was told that I was once again the chairman of the worship committee. As a result, I resigned 5 minutes later. Well, in today's lesson, we're going to meet a man who agreed to take on the leadership role for God. His name was Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a very high-ranking servant in the palace of King Artaxerxes of Persia. He was moved by the shameful condition of the walls in the city of Jerusalem, and he was willing to take on the challenge of overseeing a rebuilding of the walls. Now, do you remember a few years ago when they tore down the old City Hall building in Orlando? They called on a company that destroys buildings by imploding them. I mean, TV news cameras were everywhere. There were thousands of people on hand to watch the once useful building be reduced to a pile of rubble. But how many people were there on hand to watch it being built? I mean, I would venture a guess that most people found that the dust and the noise was rather annoying as it was being built. You see, people seem to be much more interested in seeing things destroyed than they are in seeing things being built. Fact is, it's much easier to destroy something than to build something. I mean, you can destroy a building in a few seconds, but building it takes a lot more time and effort. Because of this, it's hard to motivate people to start a building project. But that was a job that Nehemiah took. Now, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were originally presented as chapters 1 and 2 of the same book. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, these two books were combined under the title of Esdras Deuteron, which means second Esdras. Well, if this is second Esdras, then there has to be a first Esdras. Well, first Esdras was the original title of the two apocryphal books that are now known as First Esdras and Second Esdras. To complicate matters even worse, if we look at the Latin Vulgate Bible, the book of Ezra is called First Ezra, and the book of Nehemiah is called Second Ezra. This profusion of titles is very confusing sometimes. And it has led many people to feel that both books were actually written by Ezra. And I will admit that that is a possibility, but even if Ezra did write the book, Nehemiah, he wasn't the author. Nehemiah was the author. He was simply copying Nehemiah's memoirs. So Nehemiah is still the source of this book. So who was Nehemiah? Well, he was a member of a family that, for reasons of their own, they decided to stay in Babylon when the first and second groups of exiles returned to Jerusalem. Since he was a fairly young man, and since 90 years had passed since the decree went out from King Cyrus to allow the Jews to return home, it's obvious that Nehemiah was born in Babylon. Well, Artaxerxes is the king of Persia at the time. His stepmother was a very important figure in Jewish history. She was Queen Esther. You can read about her in a book that bears her name. Nehemiah held a very important position in the palace of the Persian king. He was the cupbearer of the king at the winter palace in Shushan, which is also known as Susa. The cupbearer was the one who was responsible for serving wine to the king. And that meant that he was also the one who had to taste the wine and make sure that it wasn't poisoned. If the cupbearer drank the wine and didn't die, then we could assume that the wine was safe for the king to drink. Well, I think it's obvious that this could be a very risky job. But it was also a job that was given to the king's most trusted servant. It also put Nehemiah in a close personal contact with the king, especially during times when the king wasn't taking care of official business. Well, even though Nehemiah had a very important job in the palace, he still shows great concern over the work that was being done in Jerusalem. And he was very interested in hearing about how the reconstruction was progressing. After all, it had been 90 years since the exiles had returned. I mean, surely the reconstruction had been pretty much completed by then, but he found out that this was not the case. Take a look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hagaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, which is November, December on our calendar, is the 20th year as I was in Susa, the citadel. Then Hananiah, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. One of Nehemiah's brothers, who was a man named Hananiah, had just returned from a trip to Jerusalem. In fact, he was probably in the palace to deliver a report of the trip when he met Nehemiah there. Well, since Nehemiah was anxious to hear about how the reconstruction in Jerusalem was progressing, he was probably waiting for his brother to arrive. And as soon as he sees him, Nehemiah asks him how things are going. And his answer is in verse 3. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who have survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Not exactly the glowing report that Nehemiah was expecting to hear. God's people might be back in Jerusalem, but it seems that Jerusalem is still a pitiful sight. It seems that the exiles who had returned to Jerusalem had not rebuilt the city at all. In fact, at this point, Jerusalem was nothing more than a frontier village. The walls were still broken down, and they haven't been removed the debris yet. Most of the city is in exactly the same condition it was in 90 years ago when they returned. This is due in part to the fact that after the Samaritans had sent a letter to King Artaxerxes falsely accusing the Jews of plotting to rebel against him, he had ordered the construction to be stopped. And I'll get to why that happened a little bit later. Now, if Nehemiah had been a typical church member today, he probably would have said something like, "Oh, that's too bad, I'll remember them in my prayers." Or he would have complained, "Somebody needs to do something." And then nothing at all would have been done about the situation. Now let me draw your attention to the fact that Nehemiah was not indifferent to the plight of his people, nor did he sit around complaining about the fact that the people were taking God's cause so lightly. Look at verse 4. "As soon as I heard these things, I sat down and wept, and mourning for days, and I had continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven." Nehemiah was so deeply concerned over the fact that God's cause was not being taken very seriously by the Jews in Jerusalem, that he just sits down and starts to cry. We can see the same thing happening in the church today. The cause of Christ is in jeopardy because people are taking it too lightly. I often wonder if the people who sit around and do nothing but complain about the plight of the church today are really concerned at all about it. If they were really concerned, they'd be doing more than simply complaining. Well, isn't praying doing something? Yes, it is. But if that's all you're doing, what that says to God is, "God, you're going to have to fix this problem all by yourself because I'm not going to help you do it." What you need to be praying is this: "God, show me how I can help fix the problem. God, give me the strength and wisdom I'll need to do something about this." You know, whenever somebody would come to me with a suggestion about something the church should be doing, my stock answer was always, "Well, I guess God has laid that on your heart, so why don't you volunteer to oversee the project?" That's when the excuses would start. I suppose I did that often enough that no one ever comes to me with that suggestion anymore. You see, just praying, "God do something," isn't what God wants from His people. God wants people who are willing to be a part of the solution. If the thing that you're complaining about doesn't truly break your heart to the point where you want to do something about it, then stop complaining about it. There's too much talk and not enough tears and action in the churches today. Well, the plight of God's people and the condition of God's city broke Nehemiah's heart to the point where he just sat down and cried. Then he took on the same demeanor as a person who was mourning over the loss of a loved one. Then he fasted and prayed that God would help him correct the problem. And notice this, he starts his prayer with a confession, and he includes himself in the list of sinners. Look at verse 6. "Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you, even I and my father's house have sinned." Now, Nehemiah isn't like most Christians today. Most Christians today are willing to pray, "God, do something." But that's all they're willing to do. But not Nehemiah. He was willing to turn concern into action. Look at verse 11 of chapter 1. "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name. And give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." During a Wednesday night prayer meeting at a small country church, a group of Christians were praying for a particular family that had suffered a great financial setback and were in desperate need of help. While they were praying, the son of a local farmer came into the church and he said, "My dad couldn't make it tonight, but he asked me to bring his prayers in the truck." When they looked outside, he saw the man's prayers were in the form of a whole truckload of food and clothing. The rest of them took a lesson from that farmer and they gave something themselves. Now, how many times do you see a problem and all we're willing to do is say, "God, do something"? And Nehemiah was willing to put his prayers into action. He was willing to be a part of the solution. Now, he asked God to grant him a mercy in the sight of this man. Well, who is this man? This man refers to the man who had ordered the construction halted in the first place, King Artaxerxes. You see, Nehemiah didn't know exactly how it could be done, but he did know that there was only one man who had the authority to make it happen. And that man was the one who had ordered the construction to be stopped in the first place, King Artaxerxes. Remember, years earlier, the Samaritans had sent a letter to the king, falsely accusing the Jews of planning to rebel against Persia as soon as the city was strong enough. So Artaxerxes had issued a decree that ordered the construction in Jerusalem to be stopped. He had no way of knowing that there really wasn't much building going on in the first place. But the Samaritans had succeeded in making sure that they wouldn't start up again. Well, Nehemiah knew that Artaxerxes was the only one who could lift that order. He didn't know how it could be done, but he did know that God could do it. So he prays that God would grant him grace in the sight of this man. Well, for the next 4 months, Nehemiah is trying to figure out the most diplomatic way to ask the king to lift that order. You see, in those days, you just didn't go around telling the king what to do, especially if you were only the wine steward. And if you valued your head, you certainly didn't suggest that the king had actually made a mistake. But God knew what needed to be done. So one day, as Nehemiah is going about his job of bringing wine to the king, his concern for the city of Jerusalem can't help but show through in his face. He's still acting like someone who's in mourning. And the king notices that Nehemiah isn't his old chipper self. So the king says, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Well, Nehemiah is terrified. You see, in those days, a servant was never supposed to let his negative emotions soar around the king, because the king might think that you were unhappy with him and chop off your head. Most likely, Nehemiah was still practicing what he was going to say to the king about the situation in Jerusalem. He just couldn't seem to get his speech the way he wanted it. But God figured that 4 months was plenty of time to get it right, so he gives Nehemiah a little nudge. Ready or not, God gives Nehemiah the opportunity to make his request known to Artaxerxes. Look at verse 3 of chapter 2. Nehemiah begins by saying what everybody has to say to the king: "Let the king live forever." Now, that was a very meaningful statement coming from a person who was tasting the king's wine in order to make sure that it wasn't poisoned. But from there, Nehemiah is at a complete loss as to how he should tactfully say what he wanted to say to the king. So he just comes right out with it. He says, "Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" At that point, Nehemiah probably figured, boy, I sure put my foot in my mouth this time. You see, in those days, to even hint that you were unhappy with something that the king had done wasn't a very healthy thing for you to do. But to his surprise, the king says, "What are you requesting?" Apparently Artaxerxes was rather fond of Nehemiah. At this point, Nehemiah says a prayer that probably went something like this: "Okay, God, this is it. You got me into this mess, and you're going to have to get me out of it. Tell me what to say." Then Nehemiah asked the king for some time off in order to go and organize the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Well, that was a very risky request. Remember, the Samaritans had led the king to believe that the Jews were going to rebel as soon as the walls had been rebuilt. So Artaxerxes may have thought that Nehemiah was telling him that he wanted to go and join the rebellion. But apparently Artaxerxes trusted Nehemiah and knew that he would never do that. Of course, we all know that this was God's answer to Nehemiah's prayer: "And give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." So God sort of whispers in the king's ear, having a fortified city in Judea would not be a bad idea. And you know that Nehemiah's loyal. So if you were to put him in charge, you can be sure that the Jews won't rebel against you. Now, the downside to that idea was the fact that Artaxerxes would have to find a new cupbearer. And then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" And Nehemiah gives him a time. So it's pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. Now, the fact that Nehemiah could do that tells us that he had done some homework. And at the very least, he had an idea about what needed to be done in Jerusalem. Now, notice that he says that the queen was also sitting with them. Since the queen wasn't usually present when the king was administering the affairs of state, this must have been a very informal gathering. They may have been eating a meal and Nehemiah was serving the wine. He probably mentioned the fact that the queen was there because she may have poked the king in the ribs and said, "Oh, go ahead and let him go. You can live without him that long." So Artaxerxes agrees, and he allows Nehemiah to have the time off that he requests. Well, Nehemiah figures that while he's on a roll, he's going to go for broke. Look at verse 7. "And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors and the provinces beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah." The journey was going to be long and hard. It was almost 900 miles from Shushan to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah realizes that the government officials that he might meet along the way might not believe that the king had actually sent a mere cupbearer to do such an important job. So he figures that he better get it in writing. The next request is going to cost the king some money. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the walls of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. Well, Artaxerxes actually does him one better. He gives him the letters, he gives him the lumber, and he also sends a good-sized group of soldiers along with him to protect him. Friends, when God decides to bless you, the sky's the limit. And notice that Nehemiah gives credit where credit is due. "And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon him." Now, the fortress that Nehemiah is referring to in verse 8 is located just north of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Nehemiah wanted to rebuild it because he needed a place for his small army to live. King Herod would remodel that fortress just before Jesus was born, and he would rename it Antonia in honor of Mark Antony. This was where Pontius Pilate would live when he was in Jerusalem. Well, when you're traveling with a small army, you really can't sneak up on anybody. So Nehemiah's arrival is witnessed by friend and foe alike. And three of the foes were Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite servant, and Geshem the Arab. So they weren't exactly thrilled by the news that Nehemiah was planning to help the Jews rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. These men had tried unsuccessfully to hinder the building of the temple. They probably involved with the Samaritans who wrote the letter that had caused Artaxerxes to stop the construction in Jerusalem earlier. You know, it's very interesting to see how news is received by different people. What may have been received as good news by one person is seen by bad news as another. News that the Republicans see as good is seen as bad news by Democrats. You see, the whole political philosophy since 1930s has been based on the premise that the country is going to hell in a handbasket, and every election the politicians promise to fix it for us. And here we are over 90 years later, and they're still telling us that they're going to fix it for us. The people who were stupid enough to believe them the first time vote for them the second time. So why don't they just do what they had promised and fix the problems? Well, if things really got fixed, we wouldn't need them anymore, right? So they have a vested interest in not fixing things. What I really find amazing is even elected Democrats have told the black community for years that they can't make it on their own, and if they elect Democrats, their lives will be better. But after over 90 years of making that promise, nothing has changed. But every election, people still believe that lie, and they keep voting them in. You'd think that people would have figured out the scam a long time ago, but apparently they haven't. The goal of these politicians is acquisition of power. You see, if they can make the nuclear family obsolete and have everyone relying on government handouts to survive, the government has total control over over the people. It's slavery all over again. But this time the government owns you. If you don't toe the line and do what they say, they'll take away what you need to survive. True solution is education. I mean, educated people can recognize the scam, and they have the skills needed to break out of the system. But unfortunately, the new slave owners are the ones who control the schools. A few weeks ago, a group did a survey of almost every school in New York City. I was talking about this earlier. And they couldn't find a single student who could read it and do math at grade level. But they all knew how terrible the United States was and how they would have to rely on government to survive. So no matter what color your skin is, they want you ignorant and dependent so that they can control you. You see, who you are and what your agenda is determines whether the news you hear is good or bad. A farmer may welcome a rainy day, but someone who is paying $150 a night for a hotel room in the beach at Daytona will see that rainy day as a disaster. Now, the word gospel means good news, and believers see it as good news. But the gospel is not good news to its enemies. Non-Christians see any victory that Christians get as a bad thing. This scenario is still true today. This is why the deep state establishment politicians fight so hard to make sure that conservative Christians are never elected. Well, verse 10 says, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. I guess Nehemiah must have figured that there was no sense in provoking them, so he doesn't reveal the purpose of his visit right away. Instead, he waited 3 days in order to get to know the people a little better. He knew that he couldn't present the plan to them until they had it all mapped out. So he takes a few men, and they go out at night in order to survey the job and formulate a plan for rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah is able to ride his horse part of the way around the city, but in some areas the rubble is just so deep that his horse couldn't pass through. So he dismounts and he finishes the rest of the survey on foot. All right, move down to verse 17 of chapter 2. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned? Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. It's hard to say how long it took Nehemiah to devise a plan once they had surveyed the walls. But as soon as the plan was finished, he tells the people why he had come to Jerusalem. He reminds them of how vulnerable they are without the walls to protect them. Then, in verse 18, as proof that God is with them in this project, he tells them about how God has helped him in this project so far, and that they need to get this done. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. Then in verse 19, he tells them how the people around them are convinced that they're stupid because they're living that way. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us. Then he tells them that God will be with them on this project. Look at verse 20. Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build. Then he tells those three antagonists to take a hike. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. Well, the people agreed. And verse 18 says, let us rise up and build, so they strengthened their hands for the good work. Okay, look back at verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite servant, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered and despised us and said, what is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? In today's world, that scenario would go like this. What, are you stupid? You know that you can never survive on your own. You're too dumb. You know that you need that government check every month. So if you want to keep those checks coming in, you better not do anything that we don't like. Whenever God's work is being done, Satan is going to oppose it. So it's the enemy. Whenever you decide to work for God, the enemy usually starts out by telling you how ridiculous that idea is. The opposition can even come from the very people that you thought would support you, like your family and your friends. On one occasion, Jesus had asked the disciples who they thought he was. Well, Peter jumped up and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said that he was blessed. Well, a few minutes later, Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to go to Jerusalem to die. But then Peter jumps up again and tells him that that is the stupidest idea he's ever heard in his life. Jesus was doing what the Father had called him to do. And who would have ever thought that Peter would lead the opposition? But Jesus knew exactly where this was coming from, so he says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Whenever you decide to step forward and accept a job that God has called you to do, I can guarantee you that someone is going to come up to you and tell you how stupid you are for doing it. I've been told on many occasions that it's dumb for me to be spending so much time preparing these lessons for so few people each week, especially given the state of my health. But remember where that opposition originates. When we face that sort of opposition, we need to resist the temptation to get discouraged and quit. It's more important for us to keep on doing the job that God has called us to do than it is to keep our friends happy. Well, does that mean that we should ignore all criticism? No. But before you listen to that criticism, take a long, hard look of where it's coming from. Criticism that comes from godly people can be very useful. But even if it's coming from godly people, you still need to think hard and long before you listen to it. Remember, Peter advised Jesus to not go to Jerusalem and face the cross. And I have no doubt that Peter was a godly man. So he accepted their advice with caution. But we should always, and underline the word always, ignore the criticism that comes from ungodly people. All right, Nehemiah demonstrated the characteristics that are necessary for effective leadership. First, he established a reasonable and attainable goal. He didn't bite off more than he could chew. One of the first clues that your project is doomed to fail is when you set your goal at an unreasonable level. It's been a long time ago, so I don't remember exactly who it was that said this to me, but there was a pastor in this town who had set a goal for himself of having saving everyone in St. Cloud and having them go to one church. I'm sure that you know that that was an unreasonable goal because Jesus said that many are called but few are chosen. So, since the goal is unreasonable to begin with, you know that it's doomed to fail right from the beginning. Second, Nehemiah had a sense of mission. He knew that it was God's will that the wall be rebuilt. Third, he was willing to get involved in the work. I mean, he didn't just sit around saying, somebody do something. When the time came, he was willing to work. Fourth, he rearranged his priorities in order to accomplish his goal. There are lots of people today who will say that they're willing to work for God, but they aren't willing to suffer the least little bit of inconvenience to get the job done. And there are people who will support God's work as long as it doesn't require even the slightest sacrifice on their part. I've seen lots of people in this church that agree to fill a slot on the session. They're ordained as an elder, and then they never attend a meeting or do anything remotely useful. One guy in particular did that, and before his term was up, he stopped attending the church. A few years later, he came back. And for some reason that I will never understand, somebody on the nominating committee, who will remain nameless, asked him to go back on the session, and he agreed. Well, Teresa was on the nominating committee, and she was the only one who voted against taking him back on the session. And she was right, because he pulled the same stunt again. So do these people think that being ordained as an elder is like winning a trophy that you can show off to your friends? And don't they know that God is going to hold them accountable for shirking their duties? Well, Nehemiah was willing to make personal sacrifices. I'm sure that living in the king's palace was a lot more comfortable than the accommodations in Jerusalem at that time. Plus, he had to travel 900 miles to even get to the job site. So a lot of hardship and sacrifice was required on his part even before the job actually began. Even today, traveling 900 miles isn't exactly a picnic. But can you imagine doing it through a wilderness on horseback? But today, people aren't even willing to get into an air-conditioned car and drive 10 miles to the church. It's just too inconvenient. Fifth, Nehemiah was patient. He didn't just rush in there and frantically start ordering people around. In other words, he waited for God to open the doors for him. Sixth, He showed respect for his superiors. He didn't have people marching around the palace carrying signs that says, "Build the wall, the king's unfair." He asked nicely, and then he trusted God to move the king's heart. Seventh, and underlying this one, he prayed at crucial times. He never forgot where his strength came from. Whenever the going got tough, Nehemiah went to his knees before God. Eighth, he made his request with tact and graciousness. He didn't ride into town and order the people to get to work. Instead, he convinced them of the worthiness of the project, and he gave them a workable plan. And then he worked with them to get it done. Ninth, he was well prepared. He anticipated his needs in advance. In other words, he didn't wait until the last minute to do everything. He knows that it's much easier to stop a problem from occurring than it is to solve it after it's already done its damage. 10th, he went through the proper channels to get things done. He didn't simply abandon his job as the king's cupbearer and run off to Jerusalem. Doing that would have broken the law. He waited for the king's permission. How many times have you seen a story on the news where a pastor had ignored the building codes of some city because he claims that God told him to do whatever it was he was doing? Well, that's not how God operates. God has no problem dealing with the authorities to get his will done. Remember what it says in Proverbs 21, verse 1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. The only time we are to rebel against authority is if the authority tries to force us to violate something that is specifically stated in God's Word. For example, my uncle was the pastor of a church in Rocky Mount, North Carolina that also operated a kindergarten through 12th grade school. Well, he almost ended up in jail because the state was trying to get him to stop teaching creationism in the school. They wanted him to teach evolution. And he was teaching evolution. But he was teaching his students why evolution wasn't a viable scientific theory and why the science fit the creation model better. They also got upset when he started telling his students that homosexuality and abortion were sins. I never did hear how they finally resolved the issue, but I know he didn't go to jail. And I also know that my uncle would not have budged an inch to stay out of jail. 11th, Nehemiah took time out of his schedule to rest and pray. That's the purpose of the Sabbath. For one day a week, we are to move our focus away from making a living and focus on God instead. Doesn't mean you can't do some work. You can mow your lawn or do whatever you want to do. But your focus has to be on God and not on your job and making a living. 12th, he investigated the situation personally. He did not rely on others to keep him informed. 13th, he got others involved. But he didn't do that until he knew exactly what the job would require them to do. One of the biggest reasons that there are problems in churches today is because people are recruited to do certain jobs, and then they are expected to know exactly how those jobs are to be done without any training or guidance. So it isn't long before people start complaining about how things are being done, and the person doing the job quits and will never take another job in the church as long as they live. The source of the problem usually lies in a very lazy pastor who won't give the guidance that's needed. But Nehemiah was not like that. 14th, he identified himself as being one of the people. He didn't try to play the boss. He jumped in and got his hands dirty right along with the people he was leading. As the old adage, never ask somebody else to do something that you are not willing to do yourself. 15th, he assured the people that God was with them in this undertaking, but he didn't expect them to take his word for it. He demonstrated his relationship with God through his own prayer and worship. 16th, he was confident in the face of obstacles that and he showed it. He set his goal early and he was realistic, and then he never deviated from it. 17th, he didn't waste time arguing with the opponents. Remember what I've told you, Jerry Falwell always said, never wrestle with a pig because you both get dirty and the pig likes it. 18th, he used the authority of his position wisely. He was willing to take advice, and he wasn't afraid to make a decision. And once he had made a decision, he expected it to be carried out. And 19th, he didn't let the opposition discourage him. He didn't let the opposition coming from Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem get to him. He knew that God was with him, so he just kept on working. And he let God handle the opposition. Leaders like Nehemiah still motivate us today. Millard Fuller is the founder of Habitat for Humanity. He was a very successful businessman. At least he was successful as far as our society defines success. But in spite of all his wealth, he found that something was missing from his life. So he and his wife abandoned their affluent lifestyle and they went to the Conania farm near Americus, Georgia. And while they were there, they began to attack a problem of substandard housing in America by starting Habitat for Humanity organization. Their goal was to provide safe, affordable housing to anyone who needed it. Now, the people who qualify are given a hand up and not a hand out. If they are physically able, they are required to put in at least 500 hours of sweat equity into the building of their house. Then they have to pay for the house at cost. The fact that much of the labor and the materials are donated, plus the fact the cost of the Habitat home is within reach of people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford to buy a house. Because of the dedication and leadership demonstrated by the Fullers, many churches across the country have started to build homes as part of the Habitat for Humanity project. Habitat for Humanity is now an international organization. But none of that could have happened if the Fullers had not been willing to step up and take the reins and accept the role as leaders. Far too often Christians are content to do less than they ought to be doing for the Lord. Let me illustrate. There have been years when the church just barely had enough money to make expenses. I know that because I'm married to the bookkeeper. There were many years when the employees never got a raise, and our current facility really does not give us much room to grow. But I can remember a few years ago when we needed a new roof. Plea went out, we raised the money to replace the roof. Now that was commendable. But then we sat around patting ourselves on the back for our good stewardship. You see, the money is there. God has supplied all of the funding this church needs. So the church should not be just getting by. The money is there. So there should be more than enough money in the bank every week to meet our expenses. Problem is, God gave the money to the congregation and he expected them to use the money to support the church, but a lot of the people in the congregation decided to keep the money for themselves. A lot of people seem to be content to just let the church get by. Fact is, God's people can do better than they're doing. We need to give God what is right, not what is left. What is needed is a leader that will stir them up and inspire them to act. But no one wants to step forward because they're afraid they might be criticized. Or maybe their worldly friends might think that they've become some sort of religious fanatic. Fact is, leadership necessitates taking risks. Those who lead must be willing to move out beyond the crowd and show them where to go and how to get there. Good leaders need to have a vision of the goal and a vision of how they're going to achieve it. And they must believe in that goal enough to persuade others that the goal is both valuable and achievable. Whenever leaders try to do those things, they risk being criticized. There is always someone who is satisfied with the status quo and rejects any new idea. There are always those people who resent anyone who has a backbone enough to stand up and be counted. They'll say things like, "Who do you think you are? I mean, who died and left you in charge?" I get angry whenever I hear someone say, "Boy, it seems like that guy's in charge of everything. I think it's time somebody else was in charge." Well, if they feel that way, then why don't they volunteer? But you see, they won't do it because it's inconvenient. And God forbid that they might be asked to make some sort of sacrifice. They'll work as long as the church doesn't require anything from them. People like that are a waste of pew space. And of course, they will always be those people who will say the 7 most deadly words in the church. Do you know what they are? We've never done it that way before. The point is this: good leaders usually don't find their names on very many popularity lists. And that includes leaders who generate that much needed light in the church. You see, they may generate light, but they also draw bugs when they're doing it. The scripture passage demonstrates to us the importance of good leadership among God's people. Without good leadership to inspire them, they tend to become too satisfied with the way things are. Nehemiah understood the risk involved in leadership, but he also understood that God will empower any leader who is operating in his will and allow them to do things beyond what mere human talents would permit. I mean, after all, look at how he answers his enemies in verse 20. Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will rise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. In other words, get out of the way. We are going to work because God is with us in this. We need to have that attitude in our church today. God is supporting us and doing the business of his church. We need to stop being satisfied living in a city where the walls are broken down. We need to get up and get to work. And we need some modern day Nehemiahs to lead the people in building God's church. You see, only losers are satisfied with the status quo. I remember hearing a young pastor introduce himself by saying that he was a pastor of a very small church. One of the older and wiser pastors in the group said, son, there is no shame in being a pastor in a small church unless you're content to stay one. Are you content with our church the way it is? If you are, then you are a liability to God's church and not an asset. I mean, is God calling you to be a leader? Are you hesitating because you're afraid that the work and the criticism that you might face? So you're content just that they're doing nothing. That's a coward's way out. There's no shame in being a member of a church like ours. That is, unless you're content to have the church stay just the way it is. We need to do what Nehemiah did. Rise up and build and strengthen your hands for the good work. Question?